Your ears do not deceive you. You have just entered the Cryptic Creator Corner, brought to you by your friends at Comic Book Yeti. So without further ado, let's get on to the interview.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Cryptic Creator Corner. I'm Byron O'Neill, your host for today's Comics Creator Chat, and I'm joined by co-creators James Asmus and Jim Festante. The duo have been working together on Field Tripping, The End of Times of Brom and Ben, and Rick and Morty properties. They are dropping the first issue of the second arc of their satirical puppet comedy adventure Survival Street soon with Dark Horse Ice. James has already been on the show before talking about the first volume, and I'm delighted to have them both on writing with me today. So, Jim, James, how are you both?
Great. Alive.
Can't complain.
Okay. I didn't get the
cautiously hopeful.
I didn't get the well, but we'll take alive. Alive is pretty good. Well, I want to start off with saying thank you for, I got to pull this out. I got a visual aid. So my signed promo card from San Diego Comic-Con last year. So sort of to fill everyone in here, my friend Sierra Barnes picked this up for me while signing at the Dark Horse book booth with you all. So make sure to check her book out too. That's Hans Vogel is Dead. Of note here was the fall of 2023 designation. You know, the first issue was released in August of 2022, and the second arc is now dropping this fall. Was that like a shift at maximum damage to kind of hit during the presidential election cycle? Like, what happened?
No,
you can go with that if it's mundane and you just want to go with we were trying to maximize sales.
No, if anything, I feel like my fear about us coming out in fall of 2024 is that people might be like drowning in political angst and they might not want a little more. Although I will say the goal of this book is to also be a little cathartic about it. So hopefully it's less of a pile on and more of a pressure release valve for you.
It's almost like, taking like microdosing like poison so you can kind of just like get your system used to it.
Right. Yeah. But poison and microdosing mushrooms at the same time. That's really, we might have just stumbled on the best metaphor for this book.
Was that Hannibal that did that? I'm trying to remember like the world leaders back in the day who actually did microdose poison.
Oh, yeah. That sounds about right.
It just always makes me think of Princess Bride.
Okay, sure.
So those are more my references than historical facts. But, I think... I don't know if now I can't remember if it was that we got our wires crossed or if it was overzealousness on our part that once they said we would do another volume that we thought it was that year. But Dark Horse just had a pretty full schedule. And then our artist, Abelay Kusanov, had after the first volume committed to another project kind of before it was even coming out. And so he needed time to finish that before he could start working on this. And somehow what we thought would be we would come out at the end of last year, the way schedules triangulated between publisher and artist and everything, we couldn't do that. And the next open slot Dark Horse had was this fall.
Okay.
So my fear is that people might be getting overloaded as is, but I
feel like we're a little out of the woods. Like I don't want to get too excited, but we're definitely not where we were about a month ago. So
yes.
Okay. So the anxiety is kicking in for you both. I see. I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have perpetual baseline anxiety. This book is largely
that's pretty clear.
As a coping mechanism for us and a way for us to kind of wrestle with all the things in the world that are stressing us out. And we've heard from people it's pretty effective at kind of engaging that anxiety in other people while kind of exercising it in a way that's been overall more enjoyable. Which if it's doing that for other people, I'm hugely grateful and relieved and happy to provide some of that because it's definitely doing it for us.
I'm here for it. I love this book. And now that I've got you both together, last time James told me about how you met during doing improv comedy in Vegas. So, I get to ask people all the time about comic book influences, but who are your comedic role models? Because I never get to ask that question.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think my trifecta growing up was probably early Saturday Night Live,
okay,
Second City Television, and Weird Al Yankovic. That was my holy triumvirate.
Awesome. Yeah, I would say my earliest comedy influences were the Muppets. No surprise. My dad had a bunch of comedy records I kept listening to, which were like Bob Hope, Bill Cosby, before we knew.
Okay.
And I know he had some others, but those are kind of Smothers Brothers. And then I kind of latched on early on to weird old rerun stuff on TV, like Laugh-In and like Bob Hope telethon kind of things. So there is a kind of like cheesy performative thing that I can't shake from my earliest things. But once I got into my own, Kids in the Hall was really transformative for me. In terms of kind of the weirdness, the specificity of character, the sort of sincerity with which they approached oddballs. And I think that really started to permeate a lot of my other character work.
Okay. Well, Jim, tell me about Second City, because I grew up, and I guess my comedy influences were a lot of what was on WGN, because that was like the expanded cable at the time. Mm-hmm. So I had the Jeffersons and Sanford and Son. So those were mine.
Yeah, I had
Red Box. So
I had this friend in third grade that we were like super tight, and we, would always hang out. I loved his family. Like his parents were really cool, and his dad was just into like, he would, again, in third grade, would just show us like SCTV and, again, like kind of like the first couple of years of Saturday Night Live. And it was just like, what is this? This is fantastic. So I've always just like kind of had an affinity, like James, like what you're saying too, about just like kind of those oddball sketches, especially SCTV was just so, like SNL was cool. And I don't know if I would ever describe SCTV as cool, except in a counter cool kind of like so nerdy it was cool kind of thing. But like, but all of those people, like, Eugene Levy, Catherine O'Hara, Martin Short, like just
John
genius. John Candy, genius level people, Rick Moranis, like, So it was just having that introduction. And then, just like the sheer amount of Weird Al that I listened to. There are just so many songs where it's like you hear the original unparodied song and it's just my brain just does the lyrics for whatever Weird Al version.
My son is now diehard on Weird Al over the last like year. It's just endless. So it's gotten me back into all that and caught up on anything since he's too good. Yeah, like that's very true.
Yeah,
I still play Christmas at Ground Zero every Christmas because I grew up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So we had 3 nuclear power plants in the city that I grew up. So it just feels right. It feels on brand. Well, when did the partnership doing improv comedy translate into a comics writing partnership?
Pretty
quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Because so originally Jim and I talked about doing something as a web series. There was sort of a concept that some stuff I had been doing some comedy on about like end times fiction. And we started talking about it and kind of landed on this idea that became our first comic together, an image book, The End Times of Bram and Ben. And it was really like this idea that if the biblical apocalypse happened and came true, because especially around that time, 2012-ish, there were just every 6 months, some preacher was predicting a date, like a specific date. It
was also like the Mayan calendar, I think, was around then too.
And so we were talking about like, if that happens, we are not going to get raptured. We like did not qualify for literal biblical cross your T's, dot your I's. But we were like, but we think we're good people, so it'll really suck if we're trapped on Earth when like demons start to rise and torture humans and like begin this, decades of plague and torment. And I was like, we just thought about that, like the reality of what is it to be a person when you're like, oh, I picked the wrong horse and now I'm going to be cosmically screwed for the next few years. And that just seemed ripe for comedy and commentary for us. And we started writing something we thought would be maybe like a web series.
Okay.
That we could do together as performers. But really quickly, I think the scope of what we wanted to do and talk about and explore with it just got too big for what we could accomplish.
Although, James, we did shoot a sort of pilot. So
that's right.
Don't leave that part out.
That's right. That's right.
There, floating out there somewhere on the internet is.
So hey, if any producers want to see a proof of concept for how you could adapt it with a budget, that's a low budget, but
very low.
But yeah, so the scope of what we wanted to do just got bigger, and eventually I was like, I've been doing enough comics at that point that I was like, we could try doing a first create around, and we found a great artist, Rembrew, and he Image picked up the book, and we learned a lot doing our first create around. But there's a lot I love about that book. I'm still proud of it, and the process was so much fun that we just wanted to keep working together, and we just kind of ever since then worked on stuff. There's always been something that we're always working on what's next together. And we developed some stuff for animation that didn't see the light of day, but it got us through a couple times being hired to develop some other things for people. So we've just kind of always been doing something since 2012. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And like with that improv thing too, of just like, hitting on that, like that was like for me, it was our first year of college, and our acting program was just like all improv, and I hadn't really done it before, but our mutual friend who introduced us was in my class and had been doing improv for a couple of years and put together a group, and it was like super fun. And what I've loved about that background is just like, I've never made something by myself that was better than something I've made with other people. And I really love that kind of collaboration. And so just like with the stuff that James and I get to do, like, it's just really fun to write together and kind of, come up with these different situations where we're always just asking like, okay, well, if this thing is true, like, what does that mean? And it's like, really fun to kind of dig in and explore, like, what are the ramifications of the biblical apocalypse, Republicans getting everything they want in our country. All that fun stuff.
But then to explore it with someone else, you get surprised by their brain and the connections they make and the way they elevate something and escalate it.
Especially comedy.
Yeah, and that extends to each other, but then also the artists that we've been fortunate enough to work with and the way they bring it to life and add their own flair and, visual gags and just keep raising the creative level of it. It's so addictive, and especially compared to when we were working in TV projects that kept, you hit a ceiling and one person goes, "No, we're not going to put more money into this." So this thing you love never sees the light of day. But then in comics, we could find a way to make it happen. And the fact that we keep having that opportunity has really kept us excited and has ultimately made us just kind of prioritize making comics so that we get to share what we are proud of with, whoever's up for something new and weird.
Yeah. Well, jumping into the book itself, to give people kind of an abbreviated catch up as to exactly what Survival Street is all about. After corporations have fully taken over America, a group of former childhood edutainer puppet stars get together to take on the corporate overlords and save all the children. This book really deserves more attention, and my prediction that it would win awards last time, James, seems to have been a bit premature, but you got a second volume, so I'm not the only one that liked it. And in my read through, the thing that really stuck out is it weirds me out how in this day and age we simply can't escape being part of the system. And like, I hate supporting Amazon all the time. I do it anyway because budgets are tight. I'm disabled. We have a teenager,
Sure.
all these things. And it doesn't escape me that we're chatting about a book essentially owned by a Swedish multinational corporation, the Embracer Group, with $38 billion. No, it's not. No, okay.
No,
Correct.
it's owned by
Correct
us. Me. No, this I'm very proud and grateful to say this really is a creator-owned book.
But through Dark Horse.
Our publishing publishing partner is Dark Horse, but we own all the rights to, it still is a creator-owned book where really we just have a publishing agreement with them. But if we were to make toys or a movie or whatever, that's just us. And it's us and the creative team, it's shared with artist, colorist, letterer.
But Byron, to your point, then those people making the toys are team. There are no good conscious decisions in corporate America. You just
large
can't
scale,
be
any large scale consumable.
Yeah, I mean, it all feels so incredibly
hands.
Always, right? It feels inescapable and overwhelming, which, hey, this is a perfect time to enter Murder Puppets, right? So we were introduced to Tony the Troll, Hippie the Hippo, Gurgle, Birdie, Hubert in the first volume, and their corporate attacking ways. There are so many things you could focus on. I got a review copy sent over kindly from Dark Horse, and it was really funny that prioritization was one of the very things the team is battling with as we all seek to make a little dent in this massive current shitstorm that we find ourselves in. So how did you decide what to tackle in volume 2?
We definitely wanted to not just do more of the exact same. And so while they do have new missions and different things, they're topics we're wrestling with every time, it's very conscious for this volume. We wanted to kind of pivot to what are problems within the left or any coalition trying to resist forces of power. And we wanted to sort of expand the scope of what we're talking about to talk about the problems, the headaches, what you wrestle with internally when you're trying to push back against a giant system like this. And we'll hit on a few different things through the miniseries, but one of the core ones is, when 1% have the power and you're gathering just a coalition of all the people being harmed by it, the truth is we're coming from all different places and there's all different ways people are being harmed. And so your personal investment in which battle to prioritize is going to be different. And you're also going to find uneasy allyship where you're going to disagree on how far do you want to take it? What measures are going to go too far for your code, for your morality, for your vision of an ideal outcome or society? And so the reality of that is something we wanted to wrestle with. And we were kind of anxiety predicting, once we realized this was coming out in 2024, the way the left often eats itself at a time when it needs to come together. And so there was a lot of anxious forecasting about how many ways are we going to shoot ourselves in the foot or undermine our own best efforts. How often does the left make the perfect the enemy of the good, right? And that we sort of say, unless it's exactly passing this purity test, tear it down. And it's sort of oh my God, when you're stuck with a binary decision, you're trading away better for horror sometimes. And it's just is that what we want to do? But that's not to say we have the answers either. And a lot of this arc represents that there can be two different views, and there is a real wrestling within us sometimes about how we feel about the own responsibility choices, moral choices we can make, but funnier. I'm not making it sound funny, but it's because we take the comedy very seriously, and then we dress it up in puppets with weird hang-ups and bizarre.
Yeah, because otherwise no one would want to listen or read it. You know what I mean? It's like that is what is so brilliant about satire, is just that you're able to kind of dig into these really deep, heavy things without turning people off. You know, it's why people were psyched when Jon Stewart's like, I'm coming back to the Daily Show on Mondays, and you know, you have so it's just it's being able to laugh and you know, cut through that tension makes everything a little bit more palatable. And then like, that step back just allows you to kind of think a little bit more clearly about, what are these arguments, and, you know, what are the things that we need to talk about? Because if we don't talk about them, then we are going to perpetually just shoot ourselves in the foot by making, like James said, the perfect the enemy of good.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite bit was poking fun at schools being privatized. You know, just this week I discovered that the standardized ACT test that high schoolers take for college applications, since we're in that phase ourselves, has now moved into the hands of corporate ownership, formerly nonprofit. Obviously, you're exploring some controversial topics in the book, although I'd argue not much wouldn't be considered controversial in some way in these polarized times in our country. Right. So what's the difference between approaching these topics in a comic form in terms of producing a comedy centric focus over, say, a stand-up routine or a TV show? Like, what are you able to get away with differently?
Big set pieces. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can make like really fun, like that's what I loved about comics. Like when, you know, James had proposed the idea of us turning End Times into a comic book. I hadn't ever written for comics before. I mean, I've written like, you know, TV stuff or, you know, nothing that was in that format. So learning, you know, just that freedom of just, we could do whatever we want to do is something really special, because if there's a point you're trying to make, if there's a thing you're trying to do, like you can go as far as you want to with it to kind of push it. To have it be as effective as you need it to be. And so it's kind of hard to do that with other mediums unless, you know, again, you have tens of millions of dollars making a TV show or a movie.
I would also add, I think, you know, something that I love about narrative as opposed to stand-up, and I did spend a few years doing stand-up, which was really valuable, but it was like both the hardest and the worst thing that I had done in my creative career, in terms of like, just it's full credit to people who do it. And it was the biggest struggle, because I think the audience is so resistant. They really, you walk into that audience and they sit there with their arms crossed, like, okay, impress me, you know? Whereas I think, and it's because it's just one opinion being beaten at them. Whereas when you do a story like this, you can have different characters with different perspectives, and you can introduce a little uncertainty, and and so I think there's more room for audiences to find themselves in there. And so truly, like within this team, we have a spectrum of characters, from total pacifists to like militant pseudo anarchists, you know what I mean? And they're all, the story invests in all of them. And so we've heard from different people who have a different favorite character, or they identify a different person. Very interestingly, different characters as like the lead of the team, or like the lead perspective. And I'm like, oh, it's very telling to me about your perspective. Because we sort of try to have a balance. It's just something I think is valuable about narrative. We can round out the edges and have more shades of coloring to what we're saying, or a greater complexity, and just at the end be like, these things remain in conflict with each other, and this is what happens to diverging opinions,
and a literal sense of like color, right? I mean, it's a visual medium, and it's just like, it's beautiful to look at. Like, you know, Abelay's art is phenomenal. I mean, I don't understand how the man gives puppets emotions in pictures.
Yeah.
I mean, that is doubly difficult, and he pulls it off. Doesn't just pull it off. I mean, just is amazing at it. And then to have it like even further brought to life with Ellie's colors. It's just Ellie writes colors.
Yeah.
It's like, it's lovely to look at. And like James was saying earlier too, of just like finding like, what are their things that they're putting in that we haven't necessarily asked for, but like, I remember that first time too with Brennan Bram, and we would get pages back and there would just be like jokes that Rembrew had put in, and I was just like that's fantastic. I love that aspect of it. So yeah, to have something that you're also just like can appreciate visually, I think is really special too.
Well, as comedians, how do you kind of approach that shift in audience, right? How do you entertain the comic book reader as an audience of one when sort of penning a script? Because there's no feedback loop. You can't read the crowd. There's no way to walk it back. Right? So how do you know when you hit that line? Or do you just like, oh, we fucked up?
I mean, you're very right. And it's a very interesting, it's so different, especially from improv, where you really can dynamically respond to where the audience is happy to go, and if you feel like you wronged them in some way, and you can sort of tease them across the line if you realize they need more work to get where you're trying to go, or you can sort of make an apology and like pivot
or double down, or
exactly.
Just like, oh, you didn't like that, here's more.
yeah and but I truly think a couple things. One thing is humor is like music in that objectively well done things can be your taste or not your taste. And there are objectively wonderful albums that I have no interest in listening to because it's not my jam. And then there's stuff that's like, okay, musically, but I love it because it's the right flavor for me. And humor, granted, has that, right? And so hopefully we try to cover our bases and have a mix of like really biting satire, but then also really silly puppet stuff. And you try to, for us, kind of make more of a meal rather than one dish, hopefully, to mix my metaphors now from music to food. But or we're making a mixtape, you know what I mean? And so we're trying to get things that are sort of like within a range, and they're sort of thematically tied, but we're mixing up what it is to try to appeal to a broader range. And they're not something for everyone, but if you relate to the anxiety this book is based on, then there's something in there for you. And there's the light and silly side, and then there's the like earnest emotional investment in this stuff. Like I think one of the biggest things we want people to know is it seems like the biggest risk was some people just dismiss the book out of hand and never tried to read it because they just think it's shock puppet stuff.
Right.
Like they think it's sort of the lowest common denominator version of what the premise looks like to them. And I promise you, we put way more thought and effort and concern and sincerity into it than that, while also still being ridiculous. But comedically, I think, we spent enough time live in front of a broad enough range of audiences. I spent 4 years performing in Louisiana, and I spent 5 years performing in Chicago, and then I toured around the country, and Jim was in New York and New Jersey and LA, and we did shows in Vegas for crowds from all over the world. And you really kind of learn what version of your sense of humor has the best batting average.
Okay.
And so, and you start to learn, where my sensibilities resonate most effectively. And so once Jim and I both had a decade plus of that experience honing that, once we go into a script, if we both like something and we both feel like it's funny and it makes the point and it works, I feel pretty confident in putting that out into the world that it's going to hit about as well as you can for something that's still ultimately as subjective as humor.
but also, like, James and I, our backgrounds are both very much in grounded comedy. It's not just like, like, let's make jokes and offhanded things and let's just, be, silly nonsense. Like, it's always based in something. And I think real good comedy is, or at least it has been for us to experience. So we try to do that with our books as well. So, like, it is always based in an emotion, in a real thing, in real relationships. So it's not just like, you can tell when it's like kind of empty and it's just like somebody's either performing or writing something or doing something that's just like for laughs. And that's like not really where comedy comes from. I mean, good comedy is recognition. So it's just like, it has to be grounded in something real.
So I want to explore for just a sec how comedy as a mechanism can make people feel uncomfortable in a good way, in a way that promotes thought, evaluation, and not just something for purely entertainment value. I personally hate dystopian sci-fi shit, right? As a disabled person, putting myself into one of those types of narrative vehicles is depressing because I know I'm fucking toast, and it just makes me feel anxious. So comedy, however, with like the same trappings, I absolutely love. Like, I was thinking the other day a lot about how prescient the movie Idiocracy was, and recently watching like my childhood hero Hulk Hogan up on stage at the RNC convention. It's like this crazy surreal analog to Terry Crews playing President Camacho in the movie. So to my original point, why do you think comedy allows us to explore uncomfortable things in a more approachable way?
Because it's not such a turnoff. It's like, when you said that, my brain immediately went to the Apple TV show Silo and Fallout, right? Because Silo, like, my wife Emily and I tried to watch it, and it was just like, I remember reading the books like 15 years ago at this point, and I loved them. And like, it was really interesting, but like, we tried to watch the show, and my God, it was a slog to get through because it was so depressing and everything was going wrong, and they're, trapped in this silo. And then you have Fallout, which is the same premise, but it's handled in a different way where it's still serious, but there is it's all built on humor. It's dark humor, but it allows you that release and that tension, to go somewhere, as opposed to like with Silo, it was just like, you just had all this tension and nowhere to take it. There was nowhere to go with it. Whereas with, the Fallout, they gave you that moment of release. There's the laughter. They're able to kind of release that tension.
I also think so often humor, when it's done effectively, it is nudging you in the ribs at the moments of like, this is inappropriate, right? Or like, this sucks, right? You know what I mean? As opposed to, and it's meant to call out the absurdity, the schadenfreude, the like commiseration, and hopefully it's done heightened enough that there's like surprise or weirdness to it that adds a zest of fun on top of the bitter pill. And I think that mixture is so much more. First off, you feel like you're not in it alone. Someone else understands. Whereas when you're watching like straight drama and it gets to something uncomfortable, it can be sometimes hard to tell if the narrative just wants you to suffer or it's just doing it and it doesn't realize how painful it is for you as the audience. Or, like, to get specific in without being too specific, I don't write like sexual assault. Mm-hmm. And I really have a hard time watching things that have it in it, which is not to deny the existence or the problem of that. But so often I have seen it depicted in films or television where I can't tell if the film is unaware that it's painful to watch. If they're just doing it because they think it's a story beat, as opposed to if they understand the intentionality, sensitivity, the effect on the audience. And what's worse, I've seen other ones where I feel like they want you to like luridly enjoy it, or it feels like the filmmakers in some way enjoy this component. And that is horrible and uncomfortable, like another level to experience. So I think comedy approaches uncomfortableness in a knowing way and maybe I don't want to say most, but modern comedy, and certainly with us, most of the time, I'm sure we have our blind spots, but we are generally aligning ourselves with the disempowered person in these awkward scenarios. Like our empathy, our sympathy, our identification ourselves is usually with the people getting screwed over in these stories. And so I also think when comedy by people who have that perspective gets to something uncomfortable, it's usually knowing and meant to be cathartic or commiserating and a relief, as opposed to even just him being like, we see you, we feel this, and has some absurdity that makes it not just reliving a horrible kind of thing that happens for real.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, not to be too grandiose, it's just like, it's how you, I mean, it's like looking at life, right? I mean, it's so easy to just like, you can look around and be like, nothing means anything. And it's wildly depressing. And that is a valid perspective to look at. Or you could look at it and be like, nothing means anything. You know what I mean? So it's just like, why not take that second point of view and go easy on yourself, as opposed to just like, the first one, you're just gonna drink yourself to death. So it's just like, but if you have that way of just like looking at the absurdity of things, and like James was saying, like having other people around you, like we are communal animals, we're social
then you
animals.
Drink yourself to life instead of to death. And
that's social drinking.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So do that.
Well, I think about that line, right? And so are you ever afraid the thou shalt not pass tolerance line will move again, like before the issue comes out? Okay, what got me thinking about this? I logged into Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it today, and yesterday.
I like shitter, like with the X.
I call it
I love that. That works. I mean, it's a dumpster fire. But when I logged in, I saw trending J.D. Vance Jizz Cup. Okay, that was yesterday. That was not on my bingo card for the week. So we seem to be hurtling at an ever accelerated pace, and you guys are juggling with fire here, right? So yeah, not to compound your anxiety, but are you worried you'll transcend?
Yeah, we can't compete with JD Vance Jizz Cups, kind of.
Yeah, how do you keep up, right?
That's the thing is like there's nothing that we're doing that is specific to an event. It is more about the climate
systemic issues
that we're in. Yes.
Yeah. That's the thing. We don't chase an individual moment in culture or pop culture. And that's why the difference between satire and parody is a few things, but one of them is that you're addressing sort of a broader swath of reference. And so it's a systemic problem about, we've got issues coming up that are really about AI being forced into or displacing creatives to make soulless kids entertainment. And that is, there's certain things we had in mind when we were writing it, but it's not entirely rooted to one moment, one show, one whatever. It's meant to represent a bigger struggle that is happening and is going to be happening for the next several years at least. And similarly, it's why while some of our puppet characters are more directly analogous to some other ones are just kind of a squinty type. You know what I mean? Or it really is sort of spiritual, but the hallmarks are kind of all different kinds of stuff put together. And so we're not worried about like, we did this version of like, we don't have a JD Vance. We don't have like, we never name who the president is. It's just the president, the corporations were okay with picking and stuff like that. And so by not pinning ourselves to anything particular, we're able to talk about these broader things like privatization of kids' education has been increasing and increasing. There are companies for the last decade who are saying, okay, we'll fund our local education system, but it's all going to be about how our local petrochemical industry is great and it's good for everything. And you're not going to teach about climate, and you're not going to teach about fracking causing earthquakes or whatever, but we'll give you all these books to alleviate the cost of education. And so that's like one example, but there's dozens of other ones. And so when we're just talking about this systemic trend, then we can do our own weird version of it, and hopefully reality won't pass us. But I will say there's no shortage of things that we kind of have done as offhand jokes where, like, by the time it comes out, it's really happening, or it's something very close to it. Like the first volume, we had written this stuff about, forced child labor in factories in America. And then 3 months before we came out, but once the book was done, there was like an arms race among red states to see who could roll back child labor laws most fully to satisfy like local industries, to where people were like, yeah, a 9-year-old can work overnight in a meat slaughtering factory. You know what I mean? It's like, it's insane.
Especially if they're an immigrant.
Right. And it's things that when we were writing it, we thought were definitely beyond reality. And then it was catching up to us really quickly. And that's always horrifying. But then it also just means, I think, as long as we're playing kind of absurd enough with it, it actually only makes the rest of our anxiety and forecasting feel maybe a little more real, and like, yeah, we should worry about that. You should think about this. You should ask where this goes.
Well, James, I read in a recent interview of yours that you would describe the first volume as our primal scream.
Yeah.
Now you're getting the second volume to play with, which is rare air these days in comics, by the way. Congratulations. That's amazing.
Well, and thank you for, like you were an early enthusiast for it, and truly hearing people telling people, other folks, that they liked a book does more than 100 posts I could make or anything like that. Like actually hearing people enjoyed it is so much more persuasive, and we can never spend enough marketing dollars in this fractured, diffuse internet to persuade someone to buy something as much as like you telling your friend, like, no, really check this out, or comic shops recommending it. Like that makes the biggest difference, especially for original concepts like this and creator-owned books. So thank you.
Yeah.
Not to interrupt.
Absolutely. No, we're good. We're friends as long as you don't call me an influencer in any way, because I'm a Gen X, and like I hate that term. I absolutely hate that term.
Amazing.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to establish a tone, like for volume 2, and kind of the way I'm thinking about it is in terms with these team books, and so hopefully this analogy makes sense. So it becomes Avengers Assemble and or X-Men Adapt. So is the story focused on the attempt to overcome these colossal problems, Avengers, or how the characters respond and interact to it, X-Men? Because I feel like we're going to change pace here a little bit. Maybe it was one and went to the next one, or...
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think this arc, definitely, we try to have the balance of it's still the book people liked. They still have a mission every issue. It's sort of each one has its own capsule, and the events kind of keep building to a climax across the miniseries. But it definitely is very consciously examining the effect this is having on them as individuals, and at their collective, where the friction is, and how things might not be the same at the end of this series that they were in volume 1. And so I had described the first one as sort of like just our primal scream about all this stuff. And the second one, this volume considers a little more about our role in how we respond. And it's not just that fear and frustration energy, but it's also an analysis of like, well, what do we do with this?
Which is hard to get to if you haven't had the visceral fear reaction and the primal scream of the first book. it's important to have that moment, just like, just speaking, just as a person, of just like, you have to have that, to let that out before you can be like, okay, fuck, well, now what do we do about it? Like, what are the things that can like actually be solved? Like, how are we approaching this? Just the utter frustration is not, it'll drive you for so long, but it's like that will consume you. So you can't fix all the problems. So how do you narrow in on the things that you can fix? So it's kind of that exploration.
Yeah, okay. I also compared it sort of like Volume 1 was very punk rock for us, and this gets a little post-punk. We're trying to keep it catchy, but it gets a little more complex and thoughtful and sort of dynamically responding to itself.
Okay. Well, I know you've worked on X books before.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of looking at how you gel a team concept. Did those kind of experiences help you round out the various personalities of Survival Street, as a team and the composition? And I'm not thinking about powers as much as kind of how to create those internal conflict dynamics of a group and how to present them. Because after my read through of issue 1, that's where it really does feel like this is sort of going. So.
Yeah, I think, my most consistent comics consumption growing up was X books. Like Excalibur really drew me in the most, and that sort of led me to spread out through different iterations of X books. But I also like Justice League International was literally the first comic book I had gotten, and so kind of internally frictionless teams, but also teams with diverse perspectives and paths totally shaped it. So when I did get to write team books, those were always the ones that really got me thinking about what did I love about those, what kept me going, and how was there some real engaging sustenance in just the character work outside of the splashy plots that I cared about and gave me something to invest in and think about. And so on this, we definitely knew we wanted, when we were building the world, like a cast of puppets, we were always trying to think not only what's the sort of political response spectrum within them, but what's like the comedic game each of them has, and what's the different archetypical puppet type that they're meant to represent, and what are some of those different elements you bring in. And we sort of defined those games across the first arc and tried to build those through what that first arc storyline was. And in this one, we're able to invest in them, I think, even more, having played those games with like, well, what do they really want? And like deepen their characters in a way while keeping all those things true about them. And I hadn't thought about it, but I think you're right. Like having already thought about those dynamics and how to make them as engaging and real and fun, but also dramatically valuable in doing those Marvel team books. I had that kind of mechanism built into my mind, and then I was like, okay, and now we're adding comedy and social commentary on top of that. But you're just like, so I already had the exoskeleton, and then we were able to kind of make the choices outside of that to keep this all flowing together. And I'm really happy with how this whole arc plays out. And I do think, it deepens the world and deepens the characters while also still having mayhem and explosion and society is going to hell jokes in it that are hopefully, like we said, cathartic.
Yeah. And if you haven't read the first volume, you can still read the second volume. Like it's not like it's a prerequisite to understanding what's going on. I mean, these are still like one-off. We wanted to make sure that, like, yes, there is that light serialization that does have a payoff if you've read all of the books. But if you haven't and you're just interested and you're curious and you want to pick it up, like, it's not like, well, now you got to go buy volume 1. I mean, I'd love for you to buy volume 1, but you're still going to understand. You're going to get what's going on. Because, I mean, my introduction, I came to comics very late. And so it wasn't until I was like, I think probably early into college, a friend of mine was like, "Hey, have you ever read Watchmen?" And I was like, "No." So my introduction to team dynamics was complete dysfunction. So that's like, you know what I mean? So it's like I didn't necessarily need to have that X-Men experience of the team working well together to understand the dynamics of when the team is just like, shit's a fucking mess. And, you know, so it's, I just want to, you know, again, if you are curious about this, you haven't read the first volume and you want to try the books for volume 2, you don't need to necessarily dive into one.
My only beef is the incredibly positive light that you shined on Portland as a former Seattle resident. Go Sounders. I just got to get that in there.
Well, it's where I've been living for the last several years. And, it, you know, knowing the way that Portland keeps being represented in right-wing media as like, oh, it's a failed state. It's, you know, it's a DMZ and, you know, people flee for their lives as all the roads are blockaded and the air is on fire. Like it's so funny. And then we go take the kids down there to go to like Chinese New Year celebrations or do a marathon downtown or whatever. And it's like, and then I would go back home to Ohio or visit my wife's family in Indiana. And I'm like, oh, these unhoused people encampments are here and were not here 8 years ago and are likely a result of fentanyl crisis creating an unprepared level of addiction and things like that. And or, you know, unaffordable housing is happening all over the country. And a lot of these problems are systemically other places and the dial turns slightly, but they're everywhere. And it's funny living in a place that keeps being depicted as like wildly off the deep end. And I was like, well, in the world we're talking about, a lot of that would also be true for the survival street world. Like all of these problems escalate. But what I think makes a city like this different, or in some cases, I have known people who moved here when they were without jobs, without medical care, without housing, because this is a place that people kept voting to raise their own taxes to provide services and to have more food programs, to have more, you know, low-income housing initiatives and things like that. And I'm like, yeah, I think if you suddenly had nothing, you might think to move to a place that's trying to offer a social safety net that doesn't exist other places.
Because at the end of the day, the villain is capitalism.
Yeah, right. But we talk about, you know, what is the limit of people moving from places that don't want them there to places that are trying to be welcoming, but then you oversaturate and you are running out of housing. You are running out of, like, you are over indexing your services because other places are saying we're going to slash it as a way to encourage people we don't want to move away. Even a place that wants to think of itself as welcoming hits a limit when they realize it's too much, you know, and Portland has been wrestling with that internally on some fronts. And so that we definitely wanted to take a look in what is the world outside of some of these company towns. And I just felt like I could see what it is here. So,
yeah, I mean, it makes a whole lot of sense to me, and I'm just poking fun anyway.
But speaking of teams, sports teams, it did unlock the thing in our brain that mascots are, of course, also from the Snuffleupagus Islands. And so it expands the spectrum of our furry characters to include, like, oh, of course, your favorite sports team mascot is also in this culture of, you know, of sort of immigrants from the puppet islands. And so,
which is not subversive in any way.
No.
And thank you, by the way, for, I won't give anything away here, but I think it's certainly applicable to us at the Cryptid Creator Corner, who some of the new characters may have been.
Yes.
So does getting this stuff out of your heads and being able to vent out all the pent up anxiety help you sleep at night, or does it make it worse?
It's a good question. Jim, how about you?
Well, this might have to be my last question because I do have to go to therapy.
Okay.
I gotta get going out to there. I mean, anytime you talk about something, it's better. It just is. You can't just like keep things in your brain, even if it's just as minor a thing as James and I talking and writing a script and making comedy and making each other laugh. It's helpful. Knowing that it's well received by people and they took some solace in it, or got anything out of it that could just kind of alleviate that day-to-day, what the fuck are we doing feeling, I think is a good thing. And yeah, on any level.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what is it? Dreams are supposedly like the thoughts and things that hit us we haven't metabolized yet, right? Who knows if that's true, but if it is, I think us writing this is part of how we metabolize it. These ideas that we're wrestling with and the things we're afraid of in thinking about, if this is happening now, what is the world when our kids are adults and having to face it? And that's
and
the
what
origin
can we actually do about it? Yeah.
And I think my brain has always worked where, and this is kind of that comedy thing of like, if this, then what? So often I see a little news thing that's like, Disney is saying you can't sue them for wrongful death because you agreed to the terms of a free Disney Plus deal.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And that is like, my brain just says, okay, if that passes, then this is legal, then you could do this, then you could. And so all these news stories, my brain escalates. And so often when I say things like this to my wife or to friends, they're like, oh my God, I didn't think about that. Like the Disney one's pretty clear, but for some other things, I'm like, if this is true, then you could do this. This is the next step of that, whatever. And a lot of people are like, oh my God, I didn't think about it. I wasn't worried about this before you said that. And so to me, if I can share my doom prophesizing with other people and like, hopefully it makes people broaden their scope of what we're concerned about, what we want to be active about, what we want to be vocal where we can about. And who knows, but it feels like it's better than just suffering alone or doing nothing.
Yeah, and that permission to not have to feel like you have to do all the things, but just like something minor can make a difference too.
And that's part of what we get into too this round is sort of like, oh, the feeling of, do I have to solve everything? And no, but we wrestle with that, and it's something we get into in this.
All right. Well, I'll abbreviate things because, Jim, I know you need to get out of here, but I'll drop a link in the show notes for the Future Skeletons website, and we'll direct people there so they can check out the other stuff you guys got going on, including cookbooks. I understand. I wanted to get into that. This was really weird, Jim, but okay.
Both of us.
We both do it.
Yeah.
We write, Go ahead.
Yeah,
this pop culture cookbooks and cocktail books. It's been a really fun gig to get into.
So weird.
Yeah,
so
genre
fun.
cookbooks are weird. And I'm one of the rarest of cooks because my diet is super limited because of my autoimmune condition, and I'm the primary cook in our household, but I can't taste anything that I prep. So I have to exclusively go off of smell. And salting is like the trickiest bit. But like, I'm trying to imagine a BioWare Mass Effect cocktail book. Like, this sounds seriously fun to work on, though.
It was super fun. Yeah, I mean, that's like one of my favorite properties, too. And my birthday is on 7th day, so.
Nice.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. Well, folks, I guarantee you there's nothing else like this on the bookshelves that's out there. I love the first volume. After reading the first issue of the second arc, I'm confident it will be even better this time around. I'm excited about it. Make sure to get your pre-orders in. Call your shops, wherever you buy your books. Let them know you want it. And it is really funny. I could not go into these beats because it's a total spoiler. But if you're a Game of Thrones fan, that was absolutely my favorite little bit in the first issue. Jim and James, thanks for hanging out with me today. We'll leave that right there. This is Byron O'Neill on behalf of all of us at Comic Book Yeti. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.